principles with deontology. It's divided into 4 sections, and we'll look at 4 main objections to Kantian deontology. Remember, on Kant's theory, morality uh, is very rational, reasonable, and we apply the categorical imperative to different scenarios and principles to judge whether they're moral or not. By categorical, it applies to everyone. By imperative, it carries a should incumbency dimension, a pull, a call on everyone. We should all do X, Y, Z, right? Morality on Kant's theory applies to everybody, and it's a rational. Um, it has a rational support and justification. Okay, um, so for the first objection, this has to do with the role of intuitions in his theory. Kant thinks that we intuit moral truth through our intuitions. Okay, this contrasts with, say, perception, learning about something through physical sight or something like that. In this case, it's kind of like the mind's eye. When we say, "Do you see what I'm talking about?" and we mean internally, "Do you understand?" Right? So there's a faculty of intuition that by which Kant thinks we grasp moral truth. All right. Now, one concern is that some of Kant's applications, or the applications of Kant's theory in some cases, looks counterintuitive. Okay, and this arises from his absolutism. So Kant thinks that moral principles are absolute and they're inviolable, they're unbreakable. Okay, so there's never any exceptions to them. So if it's wrong to lie, it's always wrong to lie. If it's wrong to steal, it's always wrong to steal. Okay, but the problem is we can think of scenarios where lying or stealing seem morally justified, and Kant just says that he can't even accommodate those cases. Okay, one is the famous axe murderer case. If an axe murderer came to your door asking for the whereabouts of your loved ones, family members, uh, Kant says you should tell the truth where they're at because lying is wrong, right? But we look at that today and say you should lie to protect your family and your loved ones from an axe murderer. What? Okay, so some of Kant's the cases where Kant's theory can be applied his theory looks counterintuitive when applied to some cases. Okay, Kant can respond by questioning the role of intuitions by saying sometimes we're wrong with intuitions, right? So if you think there's a problem with my theory and my theory is counterintuitive, it's just an unreliable use of your intuition. But the problem there is that intuition plays such an important role in his theory, and if a majority of people see the problem, it's more likely that he's mistaken than everybody else, right? So it looks like a less than convincing response, but I mentioned it as one he could raise. Intuition is being used today in psychology, in mathematics, in logic with possible world semantics and intuitionistic logic. So it has fruitful roles in other fields of study. So um, I don't think that's going to be a good response to that objection, to that concern, that problem, criticism of his theory. Let's look at the second one. This has to do with categorical imperatives and etiquette. According to Kant's theory, when we apply the categorical imperatives to cases to judge whether they're moral or not, we're using a rational series of reasoning. We're reasoning rationally to judge whether the action or principle is moral. Okay. Um, so let's see. You begin, say, with the formula of universal law version of the categorical imperative. You begin in step 1 with the maxim. In step 2, you universalize it. You imagine everyone doing it. And in step 3, you look at the state of the world. In step 4, if a contradiction or logical tension emerges, then the maxim cannot be moral, right? So in a world, you imagine, say, the maxim something like, anytime I take a test at school, I'll cheat. And then you universalize it. Anytime anyone takes a test at school, they'll cheat. Then you look at the state of the world and you're looking for a contradiction, and one emerges because in a world where everybody cheats when they're given a test at school, it doesn't make sense that the educators would assign any tests like that because they know everybody cheats. So they know the tests are not accurate measures of their learning and education. So they wouldn't give them, right? So this contradiction emerges with the maxim. So the maxim, anytime I will be given a test at school, I will cheat, is not moral on Kant's theory, right? Okay, so this is a basic, supremely rational means of judging whether a principle or an action is moral or not. All right. That makes sense. Well, in some cases, it looks like actions receive their moral content or judgment um, received its moral content about some actions or other, based on other things than reasoning, clear, rational reasoning through principles and such. For example, Foote raises some examples of etiquette. In some countries, tipping is required by etiquette, or not required but expected. In other countries, if you don't tip too, it looks like you're doing something wrong, especially when you can. But in other countries, tipping is offensive. It depends where you're at, time and place. Um, and Foote is saying whether you tip or not, whether tipping has any moral content or not, it looks like it's dependent on the culture and not just reasoning through principles, universal principles. So her objection is Kant's theory won't capture all the moral content in the world that we recognize. Okay, that's a fair objection. Let's look at the third objection, the domain of morality. So according to this objection, Kant's theory restricts morality only to rational beings, and what that means is that, remember, his theory is a supremely rational one again, as I just walked us through an example using the formula of universal law, so that if someone cannot reason rationally through an action or doesn't have that faculty or capability, you might wonder about then their moral status. What about non-human animals if they cannot reason like that? What about babies, human babies? They're not reasoning through anything, right? So Kant's theory, because it places this premium on reasoning and rationality, it raises a concern over the question of the place of non-rational beings, whether non-human animals or babies, etc. People who were in car accidents, maybe they're in comas, right? Adults even, but they're not capable of being rational and reasoning because they're injured and in coma. Um, Kant's theory raises a question about their place, the moral place then in the world, their moral status. Um, and so this is a concern then with his theory. Does it focus too much on rationality as a condition for morality? Okay, and so the challenge there is that morality seems broader than reasons alone. All right, so let's look at the fourth objection, and this has to do with conflicting duties. As I mentioned, the famous case earlier, the axe murderer case. If an axe murderer came to your door asking for the whereabouts of a loved one, Kant says you have a duty to tell the truth. Okay, well, what about the duty to protect your loved ones? Kant denied that there were any true moral dilemmas. He did this in different ways, but ultimately is trying to get out of a problem. And the problem arises when duties conflict because, as an absolutist, if duties conflict and each are binding and absolute, then you cannot tell which one to follow. They kind of like cancel each other out. They just lead to an impasse. An impasse. You won't be able to reason further at that point because the duties, because of the conflicting duties. Okay, so Kant was trying to deny that any such conflict ever arose. The problem is, in this scenario, we recognize a clear duty to be truthful, generally speaking, in society, assuming a kind of beneficence in the community. But also, we recognize a duty to protect our families and loved ones, and a responsibility to our families and loved ones, right? So Kant's theory has problems then when duties conflict, like in the axe murder case, recognizing how to even acknowledging conflicting duties. So the way that's a real weakness with his version of deontology, but the way modern deontologists have addressed that problem following W.D. Ross is to distinguish between graded duties. Some duties are more important than other duties. So, for example, we might have you might think of a duty to tell the truth, generally speaking, and that's very important. And in some cases, you might think, well, what's a specific kind of application or a more specific duty? And you might have a very specific duty to generally be honest with your loved one or partner, spouse, etc., about the quality of their cooking. And if they make a dinner you don't particularly like, you might think, hey, a white lie isn't that big of a deal. But even if you think it is, how important is it relative to something like national security, right? The protection of the country. So if you say, I didn't like lasagna tonight, honey, or if you say, hey, I loved the lasagna tonight, even though you weren't crazy about it. Um, you have this on one hand, this scenario in the home about the role of honesty about the quality of a dinner. How important is truth and honesty when a lasagna might be cooked a little more than your preference or something, versus what looks like a very clear and important case of national of duty, and that is the protection of the country and everyone in the country. Okay, national security. So we can think of things like white lies, telling our children about Santa Claus. Some deontologists don't think we should. Others think it's not a big deal. There's an issue there. Okay, but uh, whatever we make of that, is that as important as the duty to uphold national security? Right. So it looks like there are clear cases where we can think of a gradation or a hierarchy of duties where some are really important, and even if others are, they're just not as important. If there are other duties, they're just not as important. So this is how contemporary deontologists address the problem of conflicting duties. In the case of the axe murderer, modern prima facie deontologists, then deontologists that follow morality at face value, the duty at face value that looks the most important, will say the duty to protect the life of your family and loved ones is more important than the general duty to tell the truth to strangers, especially when an axe murderer comes knocking and looking for your family. All right, so that's how they resolve that conflict. And I leave this to you. I close the lecture here. I leave this to you to read more about in the assigned readings for the week. So we looked at four objections with Kant's theory in this lecture, and thank you for joining me. And I'll see you in class.